Hi everyone, and welcome back to another tips and tricks video. This is going to be a painting of a Masai woman, and I'm doing it on a canvas that I kind of sort of ruined. It was a failed painting. So here we go. I get asked a lot how to do paintings of dark-skinned models. What tips do I have? Because they seem to be a little bit intimidating, the skin colors. And my answer to that is always just do pure color. And I'll explain as the video goes by what I mean by that. So as you can see, I'm just establishing the shapes and the lights and the darks. I'm really not going into my highlights yet. I'm just giving myself a rough outline of where my lights go and where my darks go. And for the shadows, I'm using ultramarine blue, permanent alizarin crimson, burnt sienna, and burnt umber, and I'm mixing those along as I deem fit. And some places you can tell that I'm actually just using straight up blue for the shadows, and that's what I mean by pure color. The color is what's going to make the skin look luminous and lifelike. You don't have to be scared of color per se. You can just go in with the pure color without adding white and let it mix on your canvas. And that's a mix of burnt sienna, burnt umber, and a little bit of permanent alizarin crimson. And as for the highlights, I don't use just white. I'm toning down my highlights and I'm looking at the temperature of my highlights. In some places, the highlights are warmer. In some places, the highlights are cooler. So I take my white, and I used titanium white, and add a little bit of ultramarine blue and a little bit of burnt umber to kind of make it a little bit more grayish. And I added that to the highlights. Now, if I wanted a more warm highlight, I used a little bit of warm sienna and maybe a little bit of yellow ochre and some permanent alizarin crimson, and I kind of just played with the temperature of the highlights. Now I'm going in and doing the background, and backgrounds are always tricky for me anyways. I don't particularly like this background, and I'm going to go back in and change it. I just think that it competes too much with the figure. But let's just keep going and see what works. I'm just throwing whatever I can at it. I think lightening it up will do a lot of good. It'll make the figure stand out more, and it'll make the darkness of the figure not have to compete with the background. And you know, this can be avoided if you do some preliminary sketching and painting, but I didn't for this painting. Oops. But I actually like this background much more. It is much more complementary to the figure, and I'm actually going to take a little bit of the background color and push it into the figure a little bit so that the highlights kind of give you a lost edge. And I am going in and doing the clothing of the figure, and I'm not 100% sold on how I'm doing it. I'm probably going to go back in and clean it up. And the tricky thing sometimes without gesturing over a failed painting is that sometimes I just need a minute to clear my thoughts. And as you can tell, I went in and I changed the background a little bit more. I made it lighter, and now I don't like the clothing at all. So I'm just gonna go in and figure out how I want to do it. It's a little hard to see. Sometimes when I have a failed painting, I sand down my canvas or something like that, but I didn't do it this time. So I'm establishing shapes and some lights and darks in the clothing and in the folds. And again, even here, I'm just using as much color as I can, and I tend to keep my palette analogous. The colors that I used on the face, I somehow find a way to work them into the clothing of the figure. And my favorite, I always use blue in all my paintings, and this is ultramarine blue that I used on the blue of her clothing. And for highlights, I'm actually going to go in with some cobalt blue and some titanium white and just give it a little bit more of an edge. And if I want the blue to stand out, I always tend to add a little bit of green to the blue, and it gives me a different shade of blue. And I do that with all variations of any block of color. For example, the red that I use for her clothing, I go in and I add different colors to the base red so I can create variations of the same color. So I'm going back in and adding more detail wherever I need to, and I'm going in and defining and redefining things as I deem fit. And again, when it comes to painting, sometimes I don't always get it right on the first go. I have to go in and add more highlights, change the highlights. Don't be afraid to make the mistake. Like, I'm reworking the nerves quite a bit, and until I'm happy with it, I tend to keep going. And one thing I'd like to point out is on her forehead, the color kind of blends into the background, and I see this a lot with people when they initially start out. They're scared to lose edges. And by losing edges, I mean, if you don't know what that concept means, it is that the edges and the background are not completely defined, that they kind of blend into one another. And it's perfectly okay to lose some edges. It makes your painting a little bit more dynamic and a little bit more realistic, because the colors just meld into each other, the hues just meld into each other, and it makes for a more dynamic painting. And here again, I'm going in with a little bit of blue onto her skin tone, and I'm giving all the definition that I need, and I'm going in and adding some more details to the clothing and erasing some details. I don't like to be too detailed in my paintings. And there we go. She is done. I'm signing it, and we have our Masai woman completely done.